It is now time to dive into React components. Now, React components are the core features of React that really help us build and create these user interfaces that are so dynamic and engaging for the users and which live in the browser. So let's start off talking about functional components. React provides us a couple of different types of components, and one of the most basic component types is the functional component. Now, the cool thing about our Create React app application that we've created for our to-do app, it already has an example of a basic functional component. And in this application here, it lives inside of the app.js. Now, as you can see here in this app.js component file, and we're going to get used to making sure that all of our components are in their own folders, like when we talked about the structure of a Create React app. We have this app.js, which is our kind of our root component. It is the mother component for our single page application, and it is a functional component. In other words, it is a component that has been defined using the function keyword in JavaScript. Now, in order to create a functional component, we simply import the React library. We need to make sure that we have React imported. Now, this logo, SVG, isn't important, and then we can go ahead and import our app.css, which is our component-specific style or style sheet, because it has good old-fashioned CSS in it. And then we go ahead and define our functional component using function app, just like we do when we create a function in JavaScript. The difference between a function in JavaScript and the function or a React functional component is that instead of returning some kind of a calculation or some kind of a result of computation, instead what we are returning is a block full of JSX. Now, if you remember when we were talking about transpiling and how the Create React app allows us to use React, JSX, and ES6 as we are defining our components, well, this is our big example, or our first example, of JSX. And JSX, if you remember, is a markup language that looks very similar to HTML and, in fact, is compiled or transpiled from itself, or JSX, to the actual HTML that we see inside of our browser. And for an example, let's go ahead and let's run our application and let's see how that works. So here we've got our start. I'm going to go ahead and do run. As soon as it compiles or transpiles from our ES6 to our ES5, then we get our application running right here in our browser. So now that our application is running, I'm going to go ahead and we are going to look at this really quick and we're going to see how this works. Inside of our public, remember we said that we have a single page, and that is our index.html. And that's why this is called a single page application. It's because we have one HTML page that gets pushed out by the web browser to the client, and then everything else that happens in our application is a composition of components built in React, and our UI gets updated and changed based on those components rather than new HTML being sent to us by the web server. And if we look at this, we've got ourselves a div with an ID root, and this is really our template HTML. And all of our React gets injected into this HTML page in the browser. And we should be able to see this same structure inside of our HTML in our application as it's running in the browser. And we should see that all of our components get rendered inside of this div. So let's take a look at that really quick. So here's our React app up and running in our browser. When we right click on it and we do inspect and we look at this HTML, we should be able to see that this HTML follows identically to the HTML here inside of our index.html, which came out of our public static folder. So let's double check here really quick. Let me make this a little bit bigger so that we can see it. You should see we've got HTML English, and then this is some stuff added by React saying that we're running it on localhost. We've got our head tag with a meta, a link, and then 3 more metas. So we got a meta, a link, and 3 more metas. And then we have some links here to our PNG and then to the manifest.json right here. And we can see we've got those right here, and the comments are all right there. So they're all showing up in here. And then we have the title of our app, which is React App right now. We haven't renamed it yet. And now the cool thing is that we do begin to see our style sheets for our components being injected into our page. So here under the title, we have a new style attribute, which we don't see inside of our source file. And if we look at this, we've got a body and a code. And before we talked about the fact that we have a generic CSS that's part of our index.js that gets loaded when we load our application and then we inject our React app into our HTML, we have this generic index.css where we get a body and a code. And here we can see body and code. So that generic style sheet was actually injected into our HTML by our index.js, and now we have a default style that has been added to our application. And then our second style right here is the app style, and we can see right here inside of our app.js we have that component specific style, which was app.css. If we open it up, we can see we've got .app and we've got a .app logo, and of course these are class styles that we've got in here. And if we look at this style that was injected, we have our app and our app logo and our app header, as well as the app link. Those are all of the styles that were specific to our app.js component. So that's really cool that we see that it was injected. And then we have our body here, just like in our index.html. We've got our body. We've got a warning that if we don't have scripts inactive, or if we don't have JavaScript active, then we would see this error. Then we have our root, and here's our root. And this root is what is used by our index.js. As you can see right here, we get a handle on that root element, and then we inject inside of it our React application. And here we can see we've got our root div, and now we have this additional HTML which does not exist inside of our index.html. It is dynamically injected into that div with the root ID. As you can see, it's injected right there, right into that element. And so if we begin to look at this code right here, this HTML, and we go back to our app.js, which is our first component, and that is the component that gets loaded by our index.js, and it's the component that gets injected into that div, we can begin to see this JSX being compiled and turned into HTML that is injected inside of that root div. And here we've got div with a class app. We can see we've got a div with a class name app. Now you can see just how closely JSX looks like HTML, but it's not HTML, and you can tell the difference right here by this class name. HTML uses the keyword class, as we see right here, and JSX uses class name. And of course, they both relate to a CSS class as defined inside of a style. And inside of that app.css, which we saw loaded in our header, we can see we've got an app class and an app-logo class. So here is our app set as a class in HTML, and here is our app set as a class name on our JSX. So just keep in mind that JSX looks a lot like HTML, but it's actually not. It's a markup language that is very close, but has a few differences, like when we're calling HTML attributes. They might be a little different than what we see in HTML, but super close. And it also provides us a pretty good visual of what our HTML will look like once it's injected into our page. So if we follow the structure, we've got a header with class name app header. Here we've got a header with a class of app header. We've got ourselves an image with a source, which is set to our logo, which was imported right here from our SVG. And then we have a class named app logo with an alternate text of logo. So if we look here, we should see an image with our source set to that SVG, and then a class equal to app logo and an alternate text of logo. Excellent. And then same thing here, we've got our p tag, so our paragraph. Here we've got a paragraph, we've got edit, and then we've got code, and that code is pulled in from source app.js. And so here we can see source app.js, and then some more text, and we can see all that right here actually displayed in our HTML. Then we have our classic anchor tag, which is pointing to the React tutorial, or the React web page actually, with all of these, the class name, the target, the href, and the rel, and we can see all of those in here. But you can see that JSX is almost identical to HTML with a couple of differences in that, number one, we can actually insert JavaScript into JSX using the curly braces, and we can add styles using class name. Right, so this is our first functional component, and it is being injected into our page dynamically with React. Now, because our functional component is returning a block of JSX, we need a way to take this and export it out so that it can be used. And here, with an import, we can use that exported app.js component as app, and then we can see we're using it here in JSX as a component. Now we'll get deeper into how all this works in a little bit, but right now we're doing a high-level view or overview of how a functional component actually ends up inside of our HTML. Now there are some key features of a functional component that we need to keep in mind as we learn more about React components and as we dive deeper into what React components provide for us. Now let's talk a little bit about why we would choose to make something a functional component instead of a class component. Now we haven't learned anything about class components, so you'll have to come back and apply what we talk about here to class components when we learn about them. In the class component tutorial or screencast, I will go ahead and give you a comparison between a functional and a class. That way you can see the difference at that time when you learn about class components. But for now, let's go ahead and remember a couple of key factors about functional components that we will need to remember when we learn or as we learn about other types of components. So the first big thing about functional components is that they may take input at initialization from our HTML or from JavaScript or from a parent component. So they might take data in or input in those ways, and we'll see how that happens later on. So don't worry about that you don't understand how that happens, but try to remember that a functional component may take in data or information from the HTML document that it gets put in, or through JavaScript, or through a parent component that it might be rendered inside of. Usually they are used to simply display data or capture data from users as a result of events. That's usually what we use functional components for. They usually do not need their life cycle to be managed. I think lifecycle probably needs to have a hyphen in it. Now, you don't understand what lifecycle is right now, but lifecycle has to do with the component being created, updated, or deleted from the user interface. Okay? So Just keep that in mind. That's what we mean when we say lifecycle events. And functional components usually don't need to be managed, or they don't need to manage their lifecycle events. They just simply exist, do what they do, and then die without us worrying about whether or not they're being updated or deleted or created at any given time. So we usually don't have to hook into those lifecycle events. And they usually, and I put usually in here because there's always exceptions to rules when we're programming, they usually do not need data of their own. Oops. Or they do not manage data of their own. In other words, they're usually getting their data from somewhere else. So from the HTML, from the JavaScript, or from the parent component. They aren't creating or generating data of their own. They're usually just working with data that was given to them. And so they're not managing or having data of their own. So those are the keys right here for a functional component. And usually these are how you decide whether or not a component in your user interface should be a functional component or if it should be a class-based component. And as you'll learn when we get to class-based components are the opposite of this. So it makes it pretty easy to decide if a component should be functional or if it should be class-based just by asking yourself questions relating to this. In other words, is it just simply going to display or capture data? If the answer is yes, it's probably a functional component. Will it need to manage its life cycle? In other words, will it need to know when it's created or when it's updated or when it's about to be deleted from the UI? If it doesn't, it should probably be a functional component. Will it have data of its own? Will it create data or will it manage data directly that could be considered its own data? Then if the answer is no, it should be a functional component. On the inverse, if any of these are yes, then you're probably looking at a class-based component. All right. So this is a really quick introduction to functional components. As we begin to develop a to-do app, we will see how functional components work, and we'll walk through the process of deciding whether a component should be functional or it should be a class-based component. For now, just keep these rules in mind, and this is your default first example of a functional component as generated by the Create React app. And it is, of course, your mother component. It is the primary component that loads your application. And from within this component is where all other components will be rendered. And it will be this component that is actually managing what other components are seen or active on the page at any given time.